Welcome everyone to Climate Ventures Mornings. Thank you so much for joining us. This is an event series that is hosted by the Center for Social Innovation's Climate Ventures. At CSI, we always start our events with an acknowledgement of the land, even when we're hosting virtual events. So this morning we want to acknowledge that for those of us who are in Toronto, we're gathering on the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, the Seneca, and the Mississauga of the Credit First Nations. As we think and talk about social innovation, we are sometimes discussing a shared vision for a sustainable and just future. However, it's critical that we also reflect on the past and the present to consider how we can strive towards more inclusive, resilient communities that incorporate and respect many different ways of knowing and being. And as we move our work and our lives into the digital realm, this also means considering how patterns of inequality can transcend into these spaces. On that note, we want to share this quote from Alexander Dirksen on decolonizing digital spaces. Meaningful change begins with recognition of technological innovation as a fundamentally human endeavor. Behind the sleek glass and metal enclosures of our lithium-charged lifelines are people, with each line of code carrying with it all the complexities of human existence. Technology is not a neutral force, nor are digital spaces safe spaces for all, instead mirroring, replicating, and at times exacerbating the real and pressing realities faced by Indigenous peoples and other marginalized communities in physical spaces. A social justice lens must therefore be applied to all that we design, discuss, and develop in the digital realm. So we encourage you to consider what it might look like in your work to apply a social justice lens, whether you're also hosting emergent conversations or participating in them and shaping them. And we encourage you to check out this resource called Native Land, where you can learn more about the land that you're on. Without further ado, I'm happy to introduce our guest for today's event, Laura Witt. Laura is a general partner at the Drawdown Fund, which is a growth equity fund inspired by the solutions outlined in Paul Hawken's New York Times bestseller, Drawdown, the most comprehensive plan ever proposed to reverse global warming. Laura has over 22 years of experience investing in high growth technology companies, as well as a background in consulting. We're really excited to hear her thoughts today. Laura will be interviewed by Barnabe Geis, our Director of Programs at CSI. And Barnabe started Climate Ventures and has led a range of acceleration programs that support entrepreneurs, innovators, and leaders working on climate solutions. So Barnabe, I'll hand it over to you to tell us a bit about CV Mornings and get the conversation started.
Thanks so much, Zoya. And hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Climate Ventures Mornings is an event series where we sit down with leaders helping to tackle and solve the climate crisis. These, of course, used to be in person at Climate Ventures and so featured leaders from Toronto. But as we've moved to online, we've started to feature leaders from across North America, which has been really great. And explains also, because of the time zone differences, why this event isn't strictly in the morning anymore. And we might have to consider a name change if we keep going online. Today, as Zoya mentioned, we're thrilled to have Laura Witt as our guest, general partner at the Drawdown Fund, and an active growth equity investor for over 2 decades. So welcome, Laura, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. Very happy to be here. I'm excited about the work that you're doing at Climate Ventures.
Thank you, and same here. So before the Drawdown Fund, which we'll get to in a minute, you spent much of your career working at the intersection of investing and technology. So I was hoping you could tell us a bit about your personal journey, going back maybe to even before starting your career, which is a question I'd like to ask to get to know our guests. Were there any early signs that you'd be working in fields related to investing and technology?
No, none whatsoever. So when I was in college, I studied political science, particularly international political economy. So I was really interested in the intersection between government and the economy. And I wanted to understand how the form of government influenced economic development and growth and opportunity creation, and how the forms of economic activity influenced government and the development of democracy. That was what I was into. And I shouldn't admit this, but we moved house 2 years ago, and I still have those last few boxes in the corner that haven't been unpacked because I know I should have gotten rid of them all years ago, but I started to unpack one of those boxes this past weekend, and I actually found the folder that I had when I was just getting ready to graduate from college, and I had my resume in there, and I had the list of all of the think tanks that I wanted to apply to in Washington, D.C., and I had the article on how to go get a job on Capitol Hill. So I thought it was going to be, you know, that intersection of government and economics where I worked. So I diligently sent my resume off to, you know, dozens and dozens of places and heard crickets back. So nothing. And, you know, graduation date was getting nearer, and all of these consulting firms were coming to campus to recruit people. And I started going to those presentations and listening to them. And I thought, well, you know, the work that they do is pretty interesting. And it sounds like they get really engaged in problem solving around the most difficult problems that these companies are facing. They have to go out and seek outside expertise to help them address those strategic questions. And I thought, well, you know, maybe I could learn a lot more about economics at a micro level, really understanding how do companies think about their competitive advantage and what's going to generate growth and what's going to help them drive productivity. So I thought, you know, I could try this. I would probably learn a lot at that micro level, and then I can go back and apply that. So I sort of, you know, fell into this, you know, first job out of school in consulting. And while I was doing that, I went and applied for PhD programs in political science and thought, okay, I'm going to go get my PhD and go back into that. And then my company sent me over to work in Frankfurt, Germany. And at the point I had gotten accepted to a PhD program, I thought, okay, I can get some real world experience working internationally. That would be a really great opportunity for me. Maybe I can defer the PhD. So I did that. And then my company wanted to send me to London. And I thought, well, it'd be really great to work in London for a year. Maybe I'll defer the PhD program for another year. And then I ended up wrestling with the question of, okay, do I want to go and be an academic, or do I want to be engaged in the business world where I see in the business world I could have the opportunity to influence some things that, you know, where do companies invest? You know, where do they expand? How do they generate growth? And so eventually I ended up going back to get an MBA and sort of sticking with that business route. And I'd actually worked with a client right before that who was an executive who basically wanted to buy his own company. And he hired us to help him put together the financial plans for that. He had a lot of strategies on, he had come out of the consumer apparel and home goods business. And he had strategies on how could you expand internationally and what new business lines would you introduce. And so I found it fascinating working with, probably for the first time in my life, working with an entrepreneur and someone who had this vision of what he wanted to do with the business. And I thought, oh, that's an exciting world. You know, maybe if I go back and get my MBA, I can find my way into this, you know, newly discovered world of venture capital and private equity, where you get to work with entrepreneurs who are really sort of setting their own path and pursuing that entrepreneurial vision. So that landed me in the world of private equity investing, and you know, eventually found my way to technology.
Great. So sounds like life had different plans for you when you were trying to figure out where to take your career.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
And now you're a general partner at the Drawdown Fund, of course, which invests in catalytic solutions to mitigate climate change. The fund, as Zoya mentioned, is based on Project Drawdown, which has just been a huge inspiration for our work here at Climate Ventures and at CSI. For those of you not familiar with it, it's one of the most comprehensive plans ever put forward to stop and reverse global warming. They've mapped and modeled over 100 solutions, I believe, and ranked them, which has just been, you know, amazing to see that we really actually have most of the solutions already at hand to solve the climate crisis. And so when I learned there was a drawdown fund to actually, you know, implement, because implementation is really the biggest challenge, I was just thrilled. So can you tell us a bit more about the Drawdown Fund, its connection to Project Drawdown, and your role there?
Yeah, exactly. We are a growth equity fund. So we are looking to invest in those solutions to climate change driven by companies that have, I will say, matured their business somewhat. So They will have developed a customer base. They will have revenue. They'll have proven unit economics in their business offering. And so they're really looking for capital to scale up those businesses and grow them. Just to go back and tell the origin story on the fund, my partner, Eric Snyder, got to know Paul Hawken a few years ago, just about the time that he was launching Project Drawdown. And so Paul had organized this group of over 100 research scientists working globally on all these various climate solutions, everything from forest restoration to education to plant-rich diets, solar, everything across the spectrum. And he also felt like a lot of the dialogue around climate change was crisis driven. And he wanted to shift it to a positive and say, okay, let's figure out what positive actions we can take. What could be the roadmap to improving our situation? So we started the nonprofit organization, Project Drawdown, and they really developed the frameworks and the modeling to very clearly lay out what is the effectiveness of these various solutions and what is the cost to deploy them. My partner, Eric Snyder, had come out of a background of being both an entrepreneur and an investor. And when he started talking to Paul about that, much like you, he said, oh, great. So how do we get capital behind these solutions then? And is there an investment strategy in this? Because clearly, these solutions need a lot more capital directed towards them in order to be applied in the world. Where are the gaps? And I think, people could argue there are funding gaps everywhere, all along the spectrum, from seed funding to big scale, utility scale, solar installations. But sort of looking at the roadmap of what was out there and what was happening, Eric, first of all, sort of went through with Paul and said, okay, which of these solutions are really going to be driven by commercial market adoption versus being driven by philanthropic dollars or government dollars, or even driven by culture change? Where can we take market mechanisms and use those to help accelerate the solutions? So that was sort of one filter that got from 100 drawdown solutions to a lower number, but most of them are market driven. The vast majority are market driven. And then looked and said, okay, where is capital flowing? And we saw, okay, if you want to put up a big utility scale solar installation, you can go to some of the big banks, and the risks of that are well understood, so you can get debt for that. There seems to be capital activity going on there. We looked around and saw there's some fantastic seed funds and accelerators focused on often very specific sectors. So some people really knowledgeable about food and ag, some people really knowledgeable about energy, kind of taking the very new technologies and maybe getting them out of the lab and into the commercial markets. But as we looked around, we saw there are relatively very few dollars that are mission aligned and focused on that growth stage, where the companies have gotten out, proven the commercial viability, but they're really looking for a mission aligned partner to help them grow and scale up. And so that became the strategy of our fund. We're 3 general partners. So it is Eric Snyder, Eric Turner, who came to us out of a background in both early stage investing and public market investing around industrial tech and ag tech. And then I came out of my background doing, investing mostly in software companies, but at that growth equity stage. So the 3 of us are working together on investments. We're still working on fundraising. Our target for the fund is $250 million. And our goal is to invest $10 to $30 million into each portfolio company that we work with, and to be very active, working with our entrepreneurs and helping them to succeed with their strategies.
Amazing. So many questions from that. So in Canada, one thing I've noticed, you're calling from the US, I'm not sure if we mentioned that, there's so much emphasis, whether it's government programs or investors, on innovation being the invention, the new thing, intellectual property. Whereas in the climate crisis, we know, especially thanks to the work of Project Drawdown, that we have so many of those solutions already available to us. And it's often hard for people to get investment to implement an existing solution. So my question is around your investment thesis and whether you require IP, whether you exclusively invest in Project Drawdown solutions, and kind of your criteria, because a lot of the solutions in Project Drawdown are multi-solving solutions. So they actually address several social or environmental challenges. So yeah, when we say catalytic solutions, how do you define that and how do you choose your investments?
Yeah, sure. So, as we did this filtering on all of the 100 Project Drawdown solutions, we came down to a focus on 3 broad systems, which are sustainable cities, food and agriculture, and energy. And within that, the specific sectors that we're focusing on in sustainable cities, it's alternative building materials, it's building automation, and mobility. So, we know that the built environment generates a tremendous amount of greenhouse gas emissions. Mobility is another huge area. Those are the focus areas. In food and ag, it's food waste, food distribution, and crop and soil health. And in energy, we're focused on smart grid, batteries, and low-cost distributed renewables. And really what we were doing is filtering for where are those areas that we know are being driven by commercial adoption that we think are actually at the right stage for growth equity. We think there are enough mature companies with real proven technologies and solutions that are in the market that are going to be looking for that kind of scale up capital. And it's, so our strategy is quite focused on those sectors, and all of those relate to the work done by Project Drawdown, where we can look at their models and their frameworks and say, we can understand the positive effects on climate coming from these solutions. So every investment that we make, we're looking for both really strong financial returns and very clearly measurable greenhouse gas reductions as a result of the work that that company does.
And so when you make an investment, how does that usually happen? How does a company get on your radar? What's the process, and how are those investments typically structured?
Yeah, we are, we're looking for deals everywhere we can. Each of us comes with a pretty strong professional network. So, we've gotten a lot of introductions to companies just coming in directly from people in our network, people we've worked with before, people on boards, people in other organizations that we've gotten to know who know what our investment profile is. That's actually been the main source of opportunities for us so far. We've been very active in going out and getting to know who are all the other mission-aligned funds out there, and even funds at the accelerator stage, who's got the interesting new startup companies that we want to be keeping an eye on. And so developing those relationships, letting people know that we are out in the world, that we share their mission, and that we have experience helping growth companies. That's been another great source of introductions for us. Paul Hawken himself, people reach out to Paul, people find him. He's been an advisor to many corporations, and he sees a lot of new opportunities. And then we have sort of an informal advisory board who have been working with us. Many of those people have been successful executives in the fields of sustainable cities, food and ag, or energy. And so we're talking to them and getting input from them on, what do you think are particularly interesting areas or companies that you know of that we want to be watching? So really sort of open to all sources. We're doing our own internal research, and in fact, we look at dislocations from the COVID pandemic, and we've had a few people who contacted us and said, we thought we'd be starting new jobs, but we're sort of in between things right now. Can we do anything to help you out? Because we're really excited about what you're doing at the Drawdown Fund. So we've had a couple of interns working with us just on a short-term basis, doing some research projects on specific sectors to kind of do those deep dives and uncover companies that might be a little bit off the radar screen so that we can find them. And then our process you asked about, you know, I would say we love to have a conversation with the CEO, understand what's the vision, what's the strategy, understand how the company thinks about their climate impact. And it's interesting, you know, we having that mission alignment on the management team and having that be part of the vision of the company is important to us. We've met a few companies and we look at them and we say, yeah, you know, you have a very positive climate impact with what you're doing. And they say, oh yeah, that's a nice sort of side effect. Yeah. But, you know, we like it to be central to the mission of the company. And then we'll kind of dig in and understand the business and the growth prospects and is it differentiated? You asked about IP. I would say, you know, one of the questions I asked myself when I started on this, kind of making a shift away from technology, was, is my own experience going to be relevant to these companies in these fields? And so when I was thinking about that decision and doing that diligence, I was looking at who are the companies who are active in bringing these solutions to market. And many of them at their core, they have some form of technology. They have some form of unique intellectual property, and that's the basis of the product or service that they're offering. You know, if it's, you know, it could be an obvious one like smart grid management software. Even, you know, battery companies that we're looking at, they're saying it's not necessarily about, you know, the component parts of the battery, but it's about the management software that we build for it. Right. Some of them in the food and ag sector I've looked at and I've said, well, it's not necessarily technology, but it is certainly scientific research, which was new and groundbreaking. And that's your intellectual property. And you have now commercialized that scientific research and you're going out and you're figuring out, how do we now build up the sales and marketing around that? How do we create the strategic partnerships that are going to help us get our innovation to market? So I would say most of what we are looking at has some differentiated innovation at its core.
Thank you. If we have time, I'll get back to a follow-up question on the IP, but this question is related to your fund specifically, but your opinions could definitely be beyond just your fund. I imagine that the investment case in terms of potential returns and the impact case of some of the project drawdown solutions, such as reducing food waste, tropical forest reforestation, plant-rich diets, the impact and the investment case, I imagine, don't always go hand in hand. In other words, greater impact doesn't always mean greater returns. So I'm wondering if first of all, if you agree with that, and how do you ensure that investment is still going into the most promising solutions to actually help us stop global warming, and not necessarily those that have the greater returns?
Yeah, very good question. And as I talked before about some of the filtering that we did on all of the drawdown solutions, you know, there are clearly some that would rank higher in impact, like education, where we've said, yeah, that's going to be a big impact solution, but probably needs to be fostered through government work or philanthropic work. So that's not the right area for us to focus our attention in order for us to have the greatest impact with our efforts. So we certainly, you know, we're not claiming to be able to touch the drawdown solutions that have all the greatest impact. The solutions that we did focus on, where we said, yeah, we can make a difference, a big difference in these areas, in aggregate represent the potential for 170 gigatons of greenhouse gas reduction over the next 30 years. So our sense is, hey, if we work on moving the needle in these important solutions where we think that we can make a difference in helping build really successful companies, that's the best way for us to focus our efforts. So yeah, so we're certainly not touching some areas of great impact. We're trying to have the most positive effect we can with the businesses that, you know, are within this 170 gigaton opportunity area. But those are the ones that are the best fit for the growth equity.
Mm-hmm. And I guess related to that, besides investments in specific ventures, we know that the kind of change that we need to solve climate change is broad and systemic. We need, I would at least argue, a transformation of our economic system to make sure it's more sustainable, equitable, and prosperous for all. you're working in two areas, climate change and investing, that in many ways are kind of at the front lines to inequality in terms, for example, of who has access to capital to invest, who can access that capital, who shapes climate policy, who's most impacted by that policy. So wondering from your vantage point in investment and climate action, what are the larger changes that you think we need to ensure that this transition to a green economy is a just transition? And pointedly, do you think that capitalism as we know it is up to the task?
That's a big question.
Yeah.
Big question, yeah. And I don't know if this is a controversial answer, but I am a big believer in the promise and strength of free market capitalism to drive positive solutions for everyone. Like free market capitalism unlocks the tremendous power of innovation. We look at what gives entrepreneurs the ability and willingness to take risks, the ability to launch new companies, what gives investors and capital the willingness to put that capital at risk for new ventures. We know that job creation is driven through small companies that grow because they bring better solutions to market for their customers. Having companies that really drive value for their customers, that drive efficiencies and productivities and create job growth. If you have a well-functioning free market economy, it will allow those best solutions to come to the market and to thrive. And if they thrive, then they will be creating job growth and opportunity. I think there are lots of issues with capitalism as it exists today. And, I'm excited by anyone who is focusing on how do we fix those issues? How do we fix the issue of access to capital, for example? I had a call with an entrepreneur just a couple of weeks ago, and she is an African-American female entrepreneur. And her company has gotten up to a few million in revenue, and she's raised, I think, less than $1 million in capital. She's gotten a couple of grants, and she's been through an accelerator program. And I looked at the financials and I said, wow, you've made a ton of progress with really, very little capital. You've had an amazingly capital efficient business. That's great. And she kind of paused for a second and she said, well, you might call it capital efficient. I think the problem is, I haven't had access to capital, right? I would have loved to have grown faster. I would have loved to have hired more people to the team, but I haven't been able to bring in, the big Series A round for the company yet. And it was really interesting. I said, well, have you talked to venture firm X, which I think of as being kind of the premier, early stage venture firm in the city where her company is headquartered? And she said, no, I don't know anyone there. So, I realized, okay, how do I open as many doors as I can possibly open for this, powerhouse African-American female entrepreneur who just, has not been able to kind of swim in the same pond with, the sources of capital that I think, perhaps other entrepreneurs might have access to. But a lot of it goes back to, are we being conscious about creating opportunities for people? I think even at the Drawdown firm, we've looked very deliberately at, anyone that we hire in the future. We want to ensure that we are hiring and building diversity inside of our own firm. When we look at constructing our advisory board, we want to be sure that we have diversity on our advisory board. And then there are the big issues that we need to go back to, right? When I was in the tech world, it was very often the case that 90% of the employees in any of my companies would be men. And you look back and you say, okay, who's coming out with computer science degrees? And the number of women graduating in computer science has actually been declining in recent years. So, you have to go back to education and make sure that you are fostering, the right kind of educational paths for people to access the opportunity, and to position themselves, to be in careers where there will be economic growth.
Yeah. There's so many places we could take this conversation. I'm just thinking back of an email that Village Capital sent out, I believe it was this week, summarizing some recent data out of the United States around access to capital for entrepreneurs of color, and how incredibly hard it is for them to raise capital. And part of the problem they identified is that a lot of the VCs in Silicon Valley are white men, and they there's kind of a boys' club there.
Mm-hmm.
Just trying to think of where to take the conversation. Before we go there, I just want to go back to one question around what you said around free markets, because I definitely think there's an efficiency in capitalism that can, get solutions to market and grow them quickly. However, free markets to me is kind of associated with like Milton Friedman and deregulation, and deregulation, in my opinion, is kind of what got us in this mess. And we've seen that when there's little to no deregulation or oversight, corporations will pollute our water, our air, or deplete our ozone layer, and they'll just be accountable to themselves and shareholders. So I guess I'm wondering what you mean by free market, and does it even exist? Because we see now even Trump, which is undergone one of the largest deregulation projects of perhaps any presidency, maybe apart from Reagan. There's still regulation and subsidies there, and they're still favoring mostly fossil fuels and other extractive industries.
Yeah. I mean, you're right. Absolutely. You have to have regulations that provide for protections, right? You have to have employee safety regulations. You have to have environmental protection regulations. It's important to have level playing fields, and I think that's to a certain extent where we've really gone off the rails. Fossil fuel lobby has been very powerful. And I'll disclaim I'm by far from the most knowledgeable person on policies, but I think we know that for a long time the fossil fuels have had a very strong voice around regulation. And where I'm such a big fan of free markets fostering innovation, it's because it allows the new entrants to come in. It allows for competition, right? It allows for the best solution to come to the fore. So to the extent that some of our systems no longer offer a level playing field, I'd be looking for ways to sort of re-level the playing field. Subsidies is a really interesting question, right? So, should subsidies be promoting one specific company, one specific solution? I look at, we can probably argue all day about whether Elon Musk is the right poster child for the environmental entrepreneur, but what he's done with Tesla has undoubtedly driven forward innovation around electric vehicles, and it's forced the big automotive companies to put more work into electric vehicles. Would he have gotten Tesla off the ground were it not for some of the early subsidies?
Yeah.
Good question. We look at solar and we can say now solar energy is cheaper than coal, but would it have gotten to that point on the cost curve without some of the early subsidies? So yeah, it's and it's interesting. I look at Canadian market being based here in Park City in the United States, and I've worked with companies before that have had big R&D efforts in Canada, and I look at what the Canadian government has done to foster R&D and make it more attractive to hire employees in R&D. And I think it's fabulous, right? My companies have said it's great. We were able to bring on 5 more people to work in our Toronto office because of the tax policies that exist. So, it's subsidies have certainly done their part to drive innovation in many ways.
And so now, since we're in this climate emergency, do you see, obviously I don't think it would happen under this administration, but is there a case for whether it's regulation, subsidies, or other form of incentives for the government to actively, force a wind down of fossil fuel technology in favor of climate solutions and climate action?
Well, I'm a big fan of a carbon tax. I think when you look at, the economics, right, you could say, hey, these polluting industries are generating huge negative externalities, and they're not being forced to bear the cost of that, right? So, to the economic mind that I have, I say, if you could adopt a carbon tax, that would begin to capture some of those externalities. It would begin to force those costs back on the generators of the emissions. And that would cause the readjustment that needs to happen if you get it right. Again, I think to point fingers either at specific companies, specific industries, it gets harder. But a carbon tax to me seems like the sort of leveling approach that we need to have.
Great. And back to the investment front, and to the conversation that we were having, as a successful investor yourself, do you have thoughts, and with everything that's happening in the United States right now around tackling racism and inequality, do you have thoughts around how, and to your story of this entrepreneur who had not been able to access capital for various reasons, how do we level the playing field so that more people get to join entrepreneurship? This is something I wrestle with in accelerators constantly, because our accelerators are funded through governments and corporations. They want us to have the best startups that are going to have the biggest impact in the shortest amount of time. And so by choosing those startups, you're often biasing towards people who are highly educated, people who have parents to fall back on. If the startup flops, or maybe they're still living at home, and that's just not an option for everybody. So not that we'll solve it in this conversation, but just on the investment front, what opportunities do you see for us to do better?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I tend to start with, what can we reach out and affect directly ourselves, right? And so I kind of go to mentorship, right? So I think the work that you're doing is really important. When we think about hiring, as I mentioned, we sort of thought specifically about how can we get to channels of people who may not be finding their way to us. They might not come through, our prestigious university alumni groups. How do we find the the job boards for minorities? How do we find the people who have graduated from traditionally Black colleges and universities? So we're sort of trying to figure out where can we go to find people and identify them. I would love to get more into mentorship, right? So for somebody who maybe doesn't know how to make the polished pitch, how do we provide more of that training or sort of informal guidance or advice? For somebody who doesn't know, what are the key firms that I need to be talking to? How do you provide, some of that guidance and advice? So I think there can be local groups that are sort of focused on outreach to those minority communities to help them forge some of those pathways. So that would probably be my biggest recommendation.
Which is so important, because when we talk about the climate crisis, it's these communities that are actually being the most impacted, and then often entrepreneurs will have solutions that that haven't consulted them, and there is absolutely the energy and the desire from these communities to be entrepreneurial and solve these challenges themselves, but there's so many more barriers that they face. Yeah. In terms of these solutions, wherever they may come from, these catalytic solutions, what do you think currently is holding back investment at the kind of scale that we need to see?
Yeah, and it's interesting. So we are still out on the fundraising trail. We have not yet hit our $250 million target. So as we've been out talking to potential investors into our fund, we've heard a lot of answers to that question. So, I think one of the things that I heard early on was there is no category around sustainable investing that's really well understood, that's driven, track record of strong returns in the past. So if you go to big asset managers, certainly some people are hearing from their wealth management clients, look, we want to put our wealth towards solving environmental problems. But the way they manage the big asset pools, they say, okay, look, we've got, an allocation for technology investing. We've got an allocation for healthcare investing. We've got an allocation for investing in industrials. We don't have a set allocation for investing in so-called sustainable businesses. And then when they start to look, they say, okay, what have been the big successful businesses that have been built, on this strategy, and what were the big exit valuations that were achieved? And some people, unfortunately, look back to, I'll call it clean tech 1.0, when, a number of the venture firms put a lot of capital into companies that, ultimately were going to take 10 years plus to build. And, people said, we had losses in clean tech 1.0. What's going to be different this time around? The time frame itself is worth mentioning. A lot of these companies are hard technology. They take a long time to build. We're talking to a company right now that looks really interesting to us as a growth stage company. It's got millions in revenue and hundreds of customers. And I was looking back at the company history recently, and I, was reminded, okay, this was a company that was founded in 2006, and they signed their first commercial contract at the very end of 2013. So it was, 7 years to commercialize this technology, to bring it to market, to get it through pilots, and then get that first deal signed and bring in the first revenue dollar. And that's a time frame that can be very challenging for traditional venture capital dollars. So I think that in and of itself is a challenge. And it's, it's probably also, it's not only looking at where have there been profitable exits for investors in these sectors, it's where are the teams that have had successful track records investing in these sectors. And there are a couple out there that can claim that, but it's been very interesting. We, even as we look to sort of build the Drawdown Fund, we looked around and we said, okay, who are the people who have done growth equity investing in these fields before, and they have a great track record of exits. And it's not a long list of people. So, you look at my own background, I've got a good track record of exits and successful returns for investors, but it's in technology. So it's maybe an adjacent field, but not exactly in these fields. So as you think about, what are all the boxes that institutional investors want to check before they begin funneling capital to something, I think we're sort of still in early days and proving the case around it.
And do you see an important role for the corporate sector? I mean, all these corporations now are kind of falling over one another to make their climate pledges, some probably more genuine and realistic than others. But do you see a way for the ventures to connect with corporate intentions, targets, and investment to unleash that? And I'd say maybe pension funds, the same thing, these sources of money that so far haven't been deployed.
Yeah, definitely. And, I'm not sure if any of it is altruistic, right? I think somewhere everyone is doing the calculations, right? And it's very interesting and very positive potentially, right? So companies are having their customers and employees saying, look, we're Amazon, right? Just made their big $2 billion venture fund announcement. Their employees have said, we realize all of our negative externalities that we have at Amazon. And yes, we've made the pledge as a corporation, but we want to be doing more. And large corporations realize they're in a war for talent and they want to be able to attract the right talent. And, I think that's spurring some of this action that we're seeing on the corporate side, as well of course, as consumer preferences, right? Consumers are increasingly voting to buy more sustainable products from companies that have these commitments. And then, we're seeing pension funds. I think it's quite interesting. I think to a certain extent, they're also doing the dollars and cents calculations. now that we're beginning to understand some of the near-term risks of climate change, how much property value is going to be destroyed by rising sea levels?
Yeah.
How much is going to be destroyed by wildfires? So I think, as pension funds can look at, all of their holdings and start ringing that alarm bell about, okay, we have assets on our balance sheet, and the value of those assets is going to be destroyed by climate change. How do we begin, directing our dollars in ways that will sort of mitigate some of those losses? Insurance companies, I think, have a big role to play in that too. They're parties that can understand and calculate these risks and understand, how could we price this in, right? Suddenly, so many of these properties and enterprises are really at risk. So I think that'll be helpful.
And we had this very exciting, encouraging moment before the pandemic where it seemed, at least in Canada, but I read media from around the world, climate was starting to be front page news again. People were paying attention, corporations were making announcements, and it felt like something had really shifted. Then COVID-19 has come along, obviously an urgent danger and crisis to respond to, in a way, in the short term, more urgent than climate change. But one of the things that we've seen is before this, and I'll speak to the United States since you're there, we've gone from like climate denial to, what I would call climate solutions denial, which can take many forms, but mostly it's too expensive, so we shouldn't take action, which is a bad math because it's actually much cheaper than doing nothing. But there's like, basically they said there's not enough money to do something like the Green New Deal, for example. Then COVID-19 happened, and now they're spending trillions of dollars. And so wondering what you think about COVID-19. In Canada, there's a big conversation around this opportunity and the feeling that if we don't get it right, we may have blown it forever. Like if the government now is spending more money than it will ever spend again, if this doesn't go towards a green and sustainable recovery, it's going to be very hard to marshal those kinds of resources afterwards. Not to mention the ramp up of emissions as countries try to get started as fast as possible. So wondering how you think COVID-19 helps or hinders the calculus for getting this kind of massive transformation underway.
Yeah, well, for sure, it has made people more critically aware of our need for resilience, our need to be able to marshal resources in a rational way at the local and regional level. It's made people aware of our interconnectivity globally, so I think whereas I first thought, okay, the whole focus is going to go to health issues, and maybe it's going to go to greater vaccine development. I think that people are seeing the parallels with, okay, here's this pandemic risk. How do we control and manage this virus which came upon us suddenly, to how do we manage this climate risk, which we all know is coming upon us, and how do we marshal our resources in a better way to be prepared for that. I think it's very interesting. Again, I go to some micro solutions, right? When I think about food distribution, suddenly people started thinking a lot about what's the security of our food supply chain, and does it make sense to be shipping products in from Brazil and New Zealand, or do we actually need to be sourcing food from local areas? And if we made a shift to more local sourcing from these big farms that ship across the country or internationally, that would have a dramatic impact on the transportation carbon footprint of the food that we consume. And then in terms of, okay, so where, as we're spending all these recovery dollars and these stimulus packages get passed, what are the points of opportunity? I think it's really promising, because we are going to have debate about how do we direct these dollars in a smart way? I saw the International Energy Agency, I think just yesterday or the day before, released a big report outlining here are 60 cost-effective solutions where you could be putting stimulus money to work in infrastructure, transportation.
Yeah.
And obviously I haven't gotten through all of it, but I think that they are saying, because these are such cost-effective solutions, you could actually generate, more than a point increase in your GDP growth over the coming years if you invested this money in these ways that have, very, very positive climate effects. So I'm an optimist. I'm hopeful that, as people have done this work and lay out these cases, that there'll be room for directing these dollars along those paths.
Great. Yeah. Let's hope. It's a very interesting time. And then seeing this possible trend of relocalizing our manufacturing and supply chains. I've spent a bit of time just kind of reflecting on that and wondering what the climate impacts would be. It's easy to think they're mostly positive, but this change of manufacturing potentially much more within countries could also increase pollution within nation states. And so yeah, it's very interesting to think of unintended consequences that can happen and the domino effect. I see that there's a lot of questions, and so I'll ask you two kind of shorter questions, and then we'll do the Q&A early just because I want to make sure that we can get to people's questions as much as possible. So I'll end on softer questions. You mentioned you're an optimist. I think we have to be optimists to do this kind of work, but I'm wondering now what's giving you cause for optimism?
Yeah, I love that question. So one of the things that I've been really excited about as I've been working at the Drawdown Fund and meeting companies working in these fields around climate change has been just the incredible quality of the entrepreneurs. And I feel like I am meeting the smartest, most driven people who have chosen to dedicate their lives to this work. And then I'm meeting the employees in the companies, and I'm seeing, if we're largely in a knowledge economy now, and it's all about, finding the best talent and attracting the best talent to your company, people are voting with their feet to go and work in these mission-driven companies. They're not going to work on Wall Street. And so I've been really excited that I feel like these companies just have such incredible talent, and that's going to lead to success.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. The entrepreneurs that we work with are also such a source of optimism and encouragement for me. And I'm going to, I actually lied because there was one question that I want to go back to before I wrap up my part and pass it over to the audience.
A really critical question, right?
Well, it's an interesting one to me. It's something I've been thinking about in some new programs that I'm collaborating with some people on designing. And it's around this question of IP. So I mentioned how there's, obviously, and also for good reason, often an emphasis on IP through government programs here or investment. You mentioned that a lot of the ventures you work with have IP just through the work or research they've done. And then you also mentioned Elon Musk and Tesla took this kind of, incredible step of opening up much of their patents, saying that they want people to use this IP to develop electric cars and vehicles and to electrify our transportation. So as we look at the climate crisis and the urgency, what's your view on IP, and is there a way of creating like a commons or something so that there's a greater, it's more about seeing it as we're all in the same fight, the way Elon Musk has when it comes to transportation, and sharing that IP so that we can fast track the development of other technologies?
It's interesting. So one of the things that I've observed, coming over to this environment, I feel that it is much more collaborative than the traditional tech sectors that I was in before, where people were very closed and very much, I'm competing with those guys, they're competing with me. We can't let one of our employees leave and go work for them. So I feel like there is more of a a true sense of collaboration. Yes, we're all working towards the same goals in the big picture. Let's figure out ways to help one another out. And I think it's, so for any given company, I think it would be worth asking the question, what parts of our IP could we potentially open up? Is there a way for us to, in some way, create a platform? If we have something, can we let other people build on that and extend it? And then think very carefully about what is it that's going to be the true source of our advantage in the market? And so, it's a good question, for Tesla, were they so far ahead that they felt like, we're still going to have sufficient profit opportunity, and in fact, it'll be better if other people are developing on some of the core technologies that we've started to develop. Will we benefit from that in some way? Because we'll be able to build in more of those components to what we're doing. So I think those are the key questions for any company to ask itself. What is it that we need to be very good at, where we need to maintain a lead? And might it simply be market leadership, right? If we're out there first, if we have, the biggest footprint in the market, the most customers, the most access to data that we are capturing and able to process and able to feed back into our own, loop of developing better solutions, then that's what we need to continue to drive forward on and defend. And maybe there are some other pieces of our technology that we can open up and share. The broad framework, but I think that's that's probably how I ask companies to think about it.
Yeah, it makes sense. Okay, and now truly my last question, and it's just what can our audience do, and any viewers that view this later online do to support your work at the Drawdown Fund?
Oh, get in touch if you see, great companies that need help. If you see investors who want to invest in growth funds like ours, executives who want to work in these companies, as I mentioned, entrepreneurs starting out who are looking for mentorship, we're eager to help as much as we can.
Great. And then Zoya, I'm sure you've been looking through the Q&A and you've got some questions lined up for us.
Yes, there are lots of questions. So we'll start with a few, and Barnabe, I also invite you and Laura, if there are ones that really speak to you, we can do this a bit more informally. There's a question from Mark around the time frame of expected returns on investment. So there's a question around, is there some acknowledgement for some patience in terms of when returns are made? If yes, how do you look at this and decide what is reasonable?
Yeah, it's a very good question. Given the timeframes that I referenced about, some of this is hard tech that just takes longer. It's not like software where you can write a little bit of code and get it out and get it in the hands of customers and iterate. So for us as a growth stage firm, when we look at a company, we tend to look at what do we think that this company can accomplish with its strategy over the next 5 years? How much can it grow? What markets can it be in? Where can it be with its products and services over a 5-year time frame? And honestly, looking out 5 years is really challenging because nobody has a crystal globe. But that's roughly how we frame it up. What could we accomplish and what could the value creation in this company be over a 5-year time frame? Now, if it takes longer, it takes longer. And at one point we sort of thought about, could we have an evergreen fund structure where there was, no expectation of a given fund lifetime, as is pretty typical in these fund structures. We do have a 10-year life frame. That's just sort of what the expectation is in the market. But I think we're always going to look at, for any given company, is this company going to have the opportunity to create a lot of value over the coming year as we continue to move forward with it? Is it a time, when the company can go public and sort of enter in the public markets? Will there be other structures for exit in the future? Will there be trusts that could potentially be acquirers for some of our companies? So, I think we are very much open to looking at what's the right path for our companies. But I think, the tough reality is that most of the capital that goes into these sectors expects to see some kind of transaction or event, probably in a 5 to 8 year time frame.
Great, thank you, Laura. And semi-related to that question, there was another one around how the Drawdown Fund deals with the intersectional impact of issues. So the example this person gave was for the number 6 and number 7 solutions that were listed, they focus on women and girls. So how does the Drawdown Fund approach that intersection of perhaps extractive industries, climate change, and gender equality? So it's more of a question again, like how do you assess that impact or that return?
Well, I hope I can address this. I'd say we start with looking at, can we see a clear calculation of what's the greenhouse gas impact going to be? So, we're going to look around and say, hey, are there enough reliable models, frameworks, academic work done so that we can kind of trace that impact for emissions? Now, as we look at the solution areas that we've focused on, we believe that they have positive effects on something like 2/3 of the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. So, the solution areas that we're looking at should also help to address hunger, access to clean energy, so we believe that those areas do have, those positive intersections. But we want to be very, very clear about what's our definition of success for the companies that we invest in. So it's going to be, generating great financial returns for investors and helping to prove the case that you can get great financial returns in these sectors. And it's going to be generating measurable greenhouse gas reductions. And I should have said earlier, part of what we've done, as the management team of the fund is we've tied, part of our compensation to actually hitting those metrics for greenhouse gas reductions. So, we're making ourselves accountable for that in the compensation structure as well.
Great, thank you. And there's, sorry?
Hope that addresses the question.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough one, but that was great. Thank you. There's a question from Grant around, does the Drawdown Fund collaborate with other funds or NGOs?
Yeah, for sure. And I'd say, some of the best relationships that we've had have been with some of the earlier stage funds where, they may have invested in the seed round of a company or a Series A round of a company, and they're saying, we'd love for you to get to know the management team here because they're probably going to be looking for their next round at some point soon, and we'd love for them to know a mission-aligned investor like you. So, I feel like those have been some really helpful relationships for us. As we move forward, we fully expect that we'll have co-investors working with us on our companies and working on the boards of those companies to help them with all kinds of things. So help with executive team building and help support them on policy, help support them on all their growth strategies. So we're very, very open to any other introductions to funds working in similar fields.
And then there was a question from Wayne, and I'll make it a hybrid question and throw in someone else's in there. Wayne was asking, he says, I get the growth PE fund economics and glad to see that your fund is positioned to unlock institutional capital, which is absolutely needed. Do you feel there are sufficient earlier stage investors to build your pipeline? And then he's referring to a Canadian program called SDTC. So he's thinking of a ticket size around 100,000 to 500,000. Does clean tech investment? Sorry. He says, for instance, SDTC, which is this Canadian program, does clean tech investment and recently had to launch a seed fund to invest earlier stage, as this was an identified gap in the pipeline. So maybe in the States, or since you have a global perspective, how do you see that pipeline? And just to add on one question, in terms of your own fund, somebody was asking around your minimum investments for interested investors.
Sure. So I feel like we have a really good pipeline, and I look around and, well, just to quantify it, we have several hundred companies that we have put into our pipeline that are active in the specific sectors where we're focused, that have raised at least a Series A round of at least 5 million or more. So that's one specific filter that says, yes, they've been able to get that early stage capital in order to commercialize and get that early market experience. And then I would say there are likely other companies that we have not added to our pipeline in such large numbers yet, but companies that may have more of a services model where they may not have done the Series A venture round, but maybe they've been more bootstrap companies, but still have interesting solutions in our sectors. And we've been identifying more of those through some of the proactive research that we've been doing. But so I guess I'm going to say yes. I feel like there are some really smart early stage investors who are getting these companies off the ground, and we're seeing a good pipeline of opportunities coming through those early stage funds. And then regarding investors into our fund, we have a $1 million minimum, but if you're excited about what we're doing and interested at a lower level, let us know. But it's primarily oriented towards institutions and family offices at $1 million commitment and up.
Thanks, Laura. And related to that, there is a question around how much of that $250 million target has been raised.
Yeah, we have not done our first close yet. So our objective was to be sort of close to the $100 million mark so that we could fund the first several companies in the portfolio, and generate some of those early investments to basically show to some of the institutions that have said, yeah, we want to wait for the second close. We want to see what kinds of companies you're bringing into the portfolio. So that's where we are in the stage of kind of working towards making investments. But we're out in the market looking for deals because some of the investors who have given us commitments have said, if you find the right opportunity before you get to your first close, we'd be happy to warehouse a deal for you. So that's likely to be the way that we proceed, sort of close investments prior to closing the fund.
Thanks. Barnabe, can I turn it over to you? If there are any questions that stand out to you in the Q&A?
I mean, there's one question, but I'm afraid to ask it because I don't know the answer. So I feel like it might be cruel to Laura, but it is the most upvoted question. So David Berman was asking your thoughts on Kate Raworth and donut economics. Was that a cruel pass to you? Thought you might know about donut economics, but
I'm going to need a little more context on that one.
Yeah, same here. Okay, I shouldn't have done that. Let's see, other questions. Well, Brian has a question that is interesting and Canadian focused, but I think you could apply it to the US because I think it's certainly the same case. Canadian banks are still among the biggest investors in the world in fossil fuel industries. According to the annual Banking on Climate Change report, is investing in green energy still not attractive or clear enough for our banks to dramatically change their investment focus? And certainly we're seeing that in the US with major investments in pipelines and other fossil fuel infrastructure.
Yeah, that is the question, right? And some of our direct dialogue has been more with university endowments that have kind of been through this big divestiture push. Their constituents are saying, we don't want you invested in fossil fuels. So they've been divesting some of those positions. But frankly, what we're hearing is they're looking around and saying, okay, where should we put it? Show us where are the institutional quality managers who can take large enough commitments You know, our fund at 250 million is significantly larger than a lot of first-time funds. And I think for some of the big, you know, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, they can't go into smaller funds that may be more focused on these climate-oriented sectors. So, you know, maybe they can go into generation investment management. But you know, you need to get up to the scale that's attractive for them. And then I think they're still going to stumble on where the managers that have proven a track record and positive exits in these sectors. You know, one of the things that's interesting is, you know, maybe direct investing, you know, for the entities that have direct investing efforts, that you get them past that risk aversion by saying, okay, don't invest in a blind pool fund that's focused on these areas, but, you know, here are specific investment opportunities in operating companies, and, you know, channel the flow of capital that way to begin to sort of get through that phase of risk aversion for those entities.
Great. I have a related question, but I will make an intermission just for the general education of myself and the audience who also did not know what donut economics is. Angela in the chat is telling us that it is based on bioeconomy respecting planetary boundaries. It's being implemented in Amsterdam in the recovery plan. And then David Berman adds, the donut focuses on including externalities in the economic model, including social and environmental justice, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, true cost accounting at all levels. So thanks both to Angela and David. Some further reading for myself, yes, and then and I'm sure for many other people in the audience. And Wayne had kind of a question that was directly related to what you were just saying. He's asking, what does critical mass look like for when we've made the case that investing in climate solutions makes sense? I hear many funds are still trying to make the case, as it seems you are. When is it that we'll have, or when will the case have been made?
Yeah, well, so we have been looking at, you know, there's some early studies that have been done on public companies, right? So if you are following ESG policies or pursuing sustainable investing in public equities, there are now some early studies that show, yeah, in fact, those public companies are outperforming their peers, which makes sense to me, because I think you have seen this, you know, shift in consumer preferences favoring companies with sustainable strategies. You know, we need to see the data still on the private side in order to get the money to these earlier, you know, private, not yet public companies. And honestly, you know, that will likely take 4, 5, 6, 7 years for those companies to kind of get through their maturation life cycle, to get to liquidity events that then show good returns to investors. And you know, I think we're on our way of marching through that timeline, but you know, it's going to be a number of years. And part of what we've focused on in our fundraising strategy has been, let's find the decision makers, you know, who are willing to take on a bit more risk because they see the urgency of this problem. And, you know, that's meant a focus on family offices where the key decision makers sit in one room and they're able to take on some of those risks. The institutions, I think, are going to take a little bit longer to move unless they get pressure from their clients.
And then, thank you. I think we can end on this question, which is a question that I think is relevant to a lot of us, though it's not your specifically your area of work. So fine if you don't have advice, but a lot of people wondering, you know, not a lot of people on the call have the kind of money to join your fund, but a lot of people want to align their investments to climate solutions and solving the climate crisis. Do you have thoughts or examples either from the US or elsewhere of how you know, regular investors can deploy their capital to try to make a difference, or at least maybe to not cause harm?
I'm blanking on the name, but there are a couple of online investing platforms that have this strategy, and it's, you know, you can have very, very small levels of investment. But it's basically all, you know, we can be mission aligned with what your objectives are. And you can go in and sort of pre-select, okay, I want my dollars directed towards environment, or I want my dollars directed towards social justice, or I want my dollars directed towards education or healthcare.
These are equity investments or buying public shares or?
Public shares, yeah,
okay.
yeah. But it's for, you know, it's for the sort of everyday, you know, here I've got my savings and I want to put it, you know, behind things that I care about.
Mm-hmm. And certainly we've seen this explosion in kind of ESG ETFs and different kind of ranking systems for more ethical, or at least free from, you know, weapons, tobacco, fossil fuels. So the ETF world has certainly opened many opportunities for people. And when you look at their track record, they often beat the S&P or the Dow Jones.
Yeah.
So was there any other questions that you feel that we missed in the chat?
I think we got to most of them, which is amazing. So thanks so much, Laura, for taking the time to chat with us today. Yeah, and maybe unless there's anything that you wanted to end on, anything else that you wanted to say.
No, again, I'm really grateful for the work that you're doing and, you know, the interest in your community. So, you know, you asked how people can be helpful to us at the Drawdown Fund. I guess I would say, you know, let me know how we can be helpful to you.
Yes, we work with a lot of early stage startups that have huge potential. So I look forward to some of our startups eventually graduating and being in the right spot for your fund. Yeah, thank you so much for your time, and thank you everybody for joining us.